I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor is a 240Hz monitor. I've got the game running at 240 frames a second. This high frame rate, high refresh rate combination brings with it two main advantages compared to a 60Hz monitor, or this monitor running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. It improves the connected feel, which describes the precision and the fluidity you feel when you're interacting with the game world. This is also aided by low input lag. In this case, I measured 2.1 milliseconds of input lag, so that's a good low level. It certainly indicates a low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel. So even sensitive users should be just fine with that on this one. The other advantage of this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it reduces perceived blur due to eye movement. There's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, which covers this in more detail if you're interested. But basically, most of the perceived blur you see on the monitor is linked to your eye movement, and that's strongly linked to the refresh rate of the display at an equivalent frame rate as well. The other important piece of the puzzle is pixel responsiveness. That also affects perceived blur. There's a photography technique explored in that article called Pursuit Photography using Blurbuster's Test UFO. And I'm just going to show you some pursuit photographs from this monitor at 240Hz. So you can see there are 4 different overdrive settings: off, low, middle and high. There's also a reference screen shown for the final column. That is the Gigabyte Aorus FI27QX. It's a few years old, but it's still a decent performer. It's another 240Hz IPS model, so it's good to benchmark against that. You can see that there's a certain amount of powdery trailing, as I like to call it, behind the UFO, more so with off, a little bit with low, less so with middle, a lot less so with middle actually, and gone with high, but there's some overshoot, inverse ghosting, which replaces it. So you can see bright trailing behind the UFO, and it's a bit colourful in places. That's overshoot. There's a bit of that with the middle setting, and for some transitions not shown here, which I'll explore a little bit later. There's some more noticeable overshoot than shown for the transitions in this test. But even so, middle is pretty well optimised, I'd say, and actually the reference screen is more similar to the RCA using its low setting. So yeah, they push it pretty well with middle without being excessive with the overshoot. The optimal setting, of course, depends on your own overshoot sensitivity. Some people might be particularly sensitive to overshoot, so they might actually find low nice, even at 240Hz, or similar high frame rates if they're using VRR, and I'll come on to VRR later. Or some people might find high tolerable because they're not particularly sensitive to overshoot. For me, though, I did find the overshoot overbearing with the high setting, and for some transitions it was really very eye-catching, so I prefer middle. I know some of you prefer numbers, so I've also done some response time testing using OSRTT Pro, little response time testing tool that a few other reviewers used. Just be aware that different reviewers will use different methodologies and different measurement standards, so you can't always directly compare measured response times. But I use the same RGB10 tolerance and indeed the same tool that TFT Central uses, so you can actually compare these numbers to their numbers directly, but be aware that they have their own colour coding system and I use my own colour coding system. But anyway, this is with overdrive set to off. Average initial time, that's the important thing to look at, 5.68 milliseconds, and of course the actual measured response times in the table there, they're all initial times. So with the off setting, it's not super slow, but it's not particularly fast either. But there is no overshoot recorded, which is good to see. Moving up to the low setting now, the average initial time has dropped from 5.68 milliseconds to 4.63 milliseconds, and just generally things are sped up a bit. There is a little bit of overshoot introduced, but just a very little bit recorded here, and that's why I feel we can push things a bit further. So up to the middle setting now, average initial time is now 3.68 milliseconds, so that's a significant drop from 4.63 with the low setting and 5.68 with the off setting. And you can see a lot more green or slightly golden shades on this graph than there were before, less intense orange and red. There's still some weaknesses, particularly for transitions starting with 255, which is white, or basically just bright shades if you're observing games more broadly. And I will give some in-game examples of this kind of thing, but these are what I would call high contrast transitions, where you've basically got mixtures of very bright shades and significantly darker shades, where you typically do see weaknesses even on IPS models. VA models will show more significant weaknesses than this though. So overall, pretty competent performance in terms of the response times. In terms of overshoot levels, as I mentioned, there is some overshoot, but it's not super widespread and it's not extreme overshoot, but it is moderate to high for some transitions. The high setting then, that reduces the average initial time from 3.68 to 3.08 milliseconds. So not a massive improvement, but a bit of an improvement. However, the overshoot is significantly stronger now. There's a lot of red there. And this is why, to the eye, on a broad range of transitions, I was finding this a bit bothersome. So I do, again, prefer middle, which does offer a good balance, in my opinion. So that analysis is pretty extensive really, but I do like to talk a little bit about what I see in the game. So the weaknesses, again, they're quite on the minor side. It's a bit of perceived blur in places, particularly for where it says motor trial there with the white icons as well, or the white text. So that's some of the slower transitions performed here, particularly where there are darker shades in the background, like that rag there. So a little bit of powdery trailing, as I like to call it. And you see that as well with the joins in the rock and the much brighter shades surrounding it. A little bit of weakness there. So yeah, I mean, you don't get kind of OLED level clarity, but actually as far as 240Hz models go, this one's pretty competitive using its middle overdrive setting, for those who like pretty snappy pixel responses without a lot of overshoot. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5 now. This one has a lot of darker shades, so some of the high contrast transitions are more common now. The game's running again at 240 frames a second or close to that. So yeah, there's a bit of powdery trailing in places, just adding a little bit of perceived blur, not an extreme amount. For the makeshift roof there, for example, there's a little bit of that going on, the flag post there as well. If I go in here, I can see some lovely white against a very dark background. Torturous transitions here, but even then, there's not smeary trailing or anything that I describe as heavy powdery trailing, just a bit of powdery trailing. Again, reflecting what was measured and what was shown with Test UFO. The monitor supports VRR, variable refresh rate technology. You can use adaptive sync, and that allows you to use AMD FreeSync, as well as NVIDIA's G-SYNC Compatible mode. So you can use G-SYNC Compatible mode via DisplayPort. AMD FreeSync is more flexible. You can use HDMI or DisplayPort. So VRR technologies, they keep tearing and stuttering at bay, keeping the frame and refresh rate synchronized with one another where possible. The range of operation is 60 to 240 Hz according to my measurements with my NVIDIA RTX 3090, according to what I observed with my RTX 3090. But the monitor does support LFC, low frame rate compensation, so when it went below 60 frames a second, the refresh rate would shoot up to a multiple of that. So for example, if the game was running at 50 frames a second, the monitor could be running at 100 Hz, which also keeps tearing and stuttering at bay. I've now got the game running at 120 Hz. And you may notice, and remember I'm using the middle overdrive setting still because that's my preference, you may notice an increase of overshoot. I can certainly notice that by eye. It's more eye-catching. There actually really wasn't much overshoot to speak of, which is why I didn't really talk about it with 240 Hz, some traces in places, but it's really much more noticeable now that the refresh rate has dropped. But my advice would be, if you're spending a lot of time here, then just use the low setting. That does massively reduce the overshoot, and the pixel responses are still competent for 120 Hz. If your frame rate's fluctuating a lot and you're really very rarely above 200 frames a second, you might like to just stick to the low setting anyway, just for the lower overshoot, and you still get decent pixel responses. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So some more pursuit photographs, but this time with the monitor set to 120 Hz. The reference is set to 144 Hz, that's just because I didn't happen to take pursuit photographs with that screen at 120 Hz, but it's only a slight difference. But here you can see with the middle setting here, yes, you can see some overshoot with Test UFO as well. It's stronger with the high setting. Low setting dials that down a lot. There's a little bit of shadowy trailing, or dirty trailing as I like to call it, with the low setting, mainly for the medium background, which is the middle row. The off setting does get rid of that, but it also introduces more powdery trailing. So I do consider low optimal at 120 Hz, as I mentioned just before. So yes, depending on overshoot sensitivity, you may prefer off, but I think low is better balanced. So let's just focus in on those settings a bit more. So this is off at 120 Hz. So you can see no recorded overshoot. So it's an initial time of 5.83 milliseconds. So yeah, I think we can do a little bit better. So the low setting does do better, drops that to 3.96 milliseconds. There's more green on the graph as well, that's always nice to see. And this actually just gives a pretty competent 120 Hz experience, but yes, there is a bit of overshoot for some transitions, mainly with some medium to brighter shades involved, but it's not extreme overshoot. So I would recommend trying this out, and if you really don't like the overshoot, then do consider off, but I think low at 120 Hz works pretty well. So back to the experience on the game, compared to 240 frames a second, yeah, there's a drop-off in connected feel. It isn't as good as you'd expect from the significant drop in frame rate, which VRR technologies can't do anything about. There's also an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement, and that's also reflected with the UFOs, where the UFO itself, the object, was sharper and a bit more detailed at 240 Hz compared to 120 Hz. I've dropped things down to 60 frames a second now, so the monitor's running at 60 Hz. I've actually just changed that to 62 frames a second just to make sure that LFC isn't activating, because then the monitor will shoot up to 120 Hz instead of roughly 60 Hz, which is what I actually want to show. So I'm using the low setting still, but now the overshoot is more noticeable. It's not extreme overshoot, but it does persist longer on the screen, so it is more noticeable. So this is where the offsetting may make some sense if you just want to completely eliminate that. Probably the best example of the overshoot actually is the sort of dirty trailing around the lamp there. You should be able to see this in the video, sort of this dirty halo. So again, you might want to use the offsetting if that kind of thing bothers you. But let's look at this in more detail. So now the UFOs are significantly more softly focused, indicating a significant increase in perceived blur due to eye movement. There's also that trailing to consider behind the UFOs. And as I've just said, off eliminates the overshoot. Low does have some overshoot, and that gets stronger and stronger as you go up. So I would consider either off or low optimal at 60 Hz, depending on your preferences for overshoot. And if we compare to the reference screen, the FI27QX, that performs quite similarly to the off setting. It's perhaps a bit between off and low really, but isn't too far from off on the RCA. So again, with the off versus low settings in mind, let's look at some response time data. So with the off setting, no recorded overshoot. The response times are perfectly decent for 60 Hz. They're not perfect, but they're not bad. The requirements for a good performance are massively reduced compared to 240 Hz and significantly reduced compared to 120 Hz, so you can really get away with lower acceleration levels. 5.83 milliseconds initial time, quite respectable for a 60 Hz performance. Using the low setting, it becomes a bit complicated because there's a different performance if you're looking at a static 60 Hz refresh rate versus 60 Hz achieved using VRR. So the top graph there is static 60 Hz, bottom graph, or bottom graphs I should say, 60 Hz under VRR. So the response time has dropped from 5.83 milliseconds with the off setting now to 3.99 or 3.88 with VRR disabled and enabled respectively using the low setting. But it's really the overshoot levels which have increased quite a bit more when you're using VRR versus just a static 60 Hz refresh rate. So what I was showing you in the game before, that was 60 Hz achieved under VRR. It's quite a moderate amount. It's not an extreme amount of overshoot, but it's more than I'd like. And again, the dirty trailing is probably the best example of it. Quite a bit for the makeshift roof as well. Just turn overdrive off as I have now, and as demonstrated with test UFO and the measured response times, it offers a decent 60 Hz performance. Yes, you get a little bit of extra powdery trailing, but it completely eliminates that overshoot, so I find it more pleasant. So that's a bit confusing, so it certainly isn't a single overdrive mode experience if you consider what I've just told you. So for high refresh rates, or the highest refresh rates of the monitor, I liked middle. 120 Hz I said I liked low. 60 Hz I said I liked off. And of course, between these values, then you sort of just subjectively decide which you prefer. However, the low setting, I think, is probably a good one to stick to if you're playing a wide range of games and your frame rates are all over the place, various different frame rates, because it will offer you a reasonable experience throughout the refresh rate range, even if it's not truly optimal. The monitor also has a strobe backlight setting, MPRT. So in the review earlier, I gave you some data from that saying it was locked at a brightness just above 100 nits, which to be honest is going to be a no-go for some people as it is. So it's very restrictive. But strobe backlights aren't something which you can really demonstrate in a video because you just start to see a bit of flickering. You can't actually see the benefits that it brings because it's all related to changing the amount of time your eyes spend tracking motion and reducing the perceived blur due to eye tracking. It changes the monitor from sample and hold to impulse type. However, pursuit photographs are a lovely way of exploring MPRT and strobe backlight settings in general. So here you can see the monitor tested at 120 and 240 Hz. You can use MPRT at 120 Hz and above on this monitor. Intermediate settings weren't tested, but they're really just somewhere between these two, so it's just good to see the extreme ends, I feel. You can change the overdrive setting, but I'm just sticking to what I consider the optimal setting for 120 Hz, which is low, and 240 Hz, which is middle. The same optimal setting as with MPRT disabled then. So you can see results with MPRT off and on at 120 Hz and at 240 Hz. So looking at 120 Hz, you can certainly see a bit of an improvement to the clarity of the overall object with MPRT enabled, but You might also notice some trailing in front of the UFO, particularly for the top row, for the dark background. And that also has a bit of a red fringe to it. That is because of the KSF phosphors used with the backlight. They're quite common on wide gamut monitors unless they use a quantum dot solution. And they have a slow decay rate, which leads to this sort of red fringing or colourful fringing in places. And you can also observe this when you move your eyes. So if you're not familiar, when you use a strobe backlight setting, it does flicker the backlight on and off at a frequency that should be matching the refresh rate of the display. Some people are sensitive to flickering, so that alone can be a bit bothersome, but with KSF phosphors you can also see these colourful flashes even when you're just moving your eyes around, particularly when you're observing brighter shades. I'm really sensitive to this actually, and I find it quite bothersome, to be honest. With this one I'd say it wasn't extreme. I've found some monitors with KSF backlights more annoying than this one, but this was still a bit annoying for me. But anyway, the sort of repetition and the fringing you can see with Test UFO, it's broadly termed strobe crosstalk. You can also see some overshoot behind the UFO. At 240 Hz, you can see a nice overall bump in clarity with MPRT enabled versus disabled. The main UFO, you can actually count the notches now, which is nice. The segmentation is nice and distinct. It's actually more distinct than it appears in the photo. The black lines are really nice and sharp and dark and well defined. And the strobe crosstalk now appears behind the UFO, and some of the colourful fringing appears hidden, but be under no illusion, depending on the transitions being performed, you can still see that to the eye, and I do find it distracting. And the strobe crosstalk in general, it is stronger further up on this screen, and remember that the dark UFO is displayed just a bit above centre, so it is a bit higher up the screen than the other UFOs. This is still considered the central region of the screen, which your eyes will spend most of the time looking at when you're observing motion on the screen. And I did in general, when I was using the strobe crosstalk setting in gaming, find the strobe crosstalk a bit strong for this sort of upper central region. So overall, I didn't really love the setting. It's not the worst I've seen. I've certainly seen models with more strobe crosstalk and various other artifacts than this, but with the restriction in brightness, you can't use it with VRR active, plus the strobe crosstalk and the KSF phosphor flickering, I didn't love it, and I just preferred the non-strobed experience, particularly using VRR.